On June 18, 1977, at the Civic Center in Des Moines, Iowa, over 16,000 fans stood on their feet begging for more. Elvis had just finished his set. The lights were hot, the chants were deafening. But instead of returning for an encore, the king of rock and roll did something no one expected. He walked away, leaving the arena dead silent. The Civic Center on June 18, 1977, was alive long before Elvis Presley ever appeared on stage. Fans had lined up for hours, some clutching folded lawn chairs, others with paper bags of snacks to endure the wait. By evening, the arena swelled with more than 16,000 people, families, couples, teenagers who had begged parents for tickets. Programs rustled like dry leaves in their hands, and the air buzzed with a mixture of perfume, sweat, and cigarette smoke. The stage itself shimmered with anticipation. Spotlights crawled along the curtains, catching the faint glitter of rhinestones that waited just beyond sight. The orchestra tuned, a few nervous notes drifting across the cavernous space like seagulls circling the shore. A whisper rippled through the floor seats. "He's coming." When Elvis finally stepped out, the roar nearly lifted the roof from its beams. He wore the white phoenix jumpsuit, each rhinestone reflecting the hot beams of light like shards of fire. The air cracked with the first booming chords of CC. Writer, a song that had opened countless shows before but never failed to ignite the crowd. The rafters shook. Camera flashes strobed against his face, capturing the sweat, the smug, the sheer presence of the king of rock and roll. The crowd became a single organism, a living wave of claps and screams, surging in time with each verse. Some leaned over the guardrails until security barked at them to step back. A girl in the third row fainted, overwhelmed, and her friend fanned her with the night's program until an usher stepped in. Still, the music drove on, relentless. Elvis moved with less vigor than in years past, yet the magnetism was unmistakable. Even a simple step across the stage drew a cascade of shrieks. When he reached for the scarf around his neck and handed it to a woman at the edge of the crowd, her knees buckled. The scarf, damp with sweat, became a relic. Every note seemed to promise that the night would be legendary. Fans whispered to each other, predicting what the encore might be. "Maybe Burning Love," someone said. "No, he'll close with Can't Help Falling in Love. He always does." In the back, a man raised a contraband tape recorder, careful to hide it under his jacket, hoping to preserve every moment. And through it all, Elvis's voice rose and fell like a tide. There were moments when it cracked, and others when it soared so high that the rafters seemed to ring. But in those first songs, few cared about the strain. All they knew was that they were in the presence of something they would tell their grandchildren about the night Elvis Presley came to Des Moines. What do you remember about your first concert? Do you recall that feeling in your chest, that sense that the air itself was charged with possibility? The final notes of CC Rider thundered into applause, but Elvis didn't pause. He rolled straight into Jailhouse Rock, and then Love Me Tender. Each song pulled the crowd deeper into the myth, binding them together in joy, in frenzy, in awe. And as the house lights dimmed further, there wasn't a single person in the building who believed the evening would end in silence. But none of them could have predicted how it would end. As the night pushed on, a subtle shift began to weave itself through the music. At first, it was nothing more than a crack in the voice, a stumble so minor that only the most devoted fans noticed. But by the fourth song, the cracks grew wider. Elvis wiped his forehead more often, tugging at the scarf around his neck, his breathing heavier between verses. The band, seasoned veterans of his tours, exchanged quiet glances. James Burton, steady on guitar, leaned into his strings a little harder, trying to anchor the rhythm when Elvis fell behind the beat. Ronnie Tutt on drums filled the spaces with flourishes, masking the moments when Elvis missed an entrance. They had done this before protecting him, cushioning the slips so the audience remained wrapped in the illusion. But illusions have limits. In the crowd, whispers began to ripple. A woman in the upper rows leaned to her husband. "He doesn't look well," she murmured. A teenager with binoculars pressed them tighter to his eyes, noting the way Elvis's shoulders slumped between choruses. Even those two swept up in the spectacle began to sense that something was off. Elvis reached for the mic stand to steady himself, his hand trembling slightly. The action was subtle, hidden in the spectacle of spotlights and sequins, but those closest to the stage couldn't ignore it. He pushed forward with Hound Dog, his voice dipping lower than usual, straining against the melody. The crowd clapped along faithfully, as though their devotion could will him back to strength. Still, the signs multiplied. The sweat came faster, not the glow of performance, but the sheen of a man carrying more weight than his body allowed. Between songs, his smile flickered, a mask slipping. Yet even in his weariness, the audience clung to hope. They roared after every number, as if sheer volume could lift him. In those cheers, there was both celebration and denial, the refusal to admit their hero was faltering before their eyes. Backstage, staff exchanged nervous glances. A stagehand whispered to another, "He's pushing too hard tonight," but none dared intervene. This was Elvis Presley, the man who had filled stadiums, who had conquered television, who had reinvented music itself. Who could tell him to stop? And so the songs continued, each one carrying a shadow. Beneath the glitter and thunder, a quiet dread began to pulse through the arena. The king was here, but something in him was breaking. The audience felt it, though they couldn't name it. A night that had begun in pure triumph now teetered on an edge no one expected. When the final notes of "Can't Help Falling in Love" drifted into the rafters, the arena erupted. Applause thundered like a stampede. Fans leaped to their feet, waving programs, holding lighters, screaming until their voices cracked. For many, the end of the song signaled not a goodbye, but a pause and interlude before the encore they had been waiting for all night. Encore was tradition. It was ritual. Elvis always came back. The house lights stayed dim, keeping hope alive. In the lower rows, teenagers pressed forward against the barricade, chanting his name in waves, Elvis. Elvis, a man in a blue windbreaker, cupped his hands around his mouth, shouting, "One more." His cry was swallowed by 100 others. Minutes passed, and the chanting grew louder, more urgent. Feet pounded on the concrete floor, rattling soda cups. A group in the balcony began clapping in unison, trying to summon him back with rhythm. The noise swelled into something primal, crowd refusing to let go. Backstage, the band had already begun to pack up. Burton loosened his guitar strap. Tutt wiped sweat from his brow. They knew the truth. Elvis wasn't coming back. But out front, no one wanted to believe it. A mother lifted her young daughter onto her shoulders so she could see the stage better. "Just wait," she whispered. "He'll come back." The little girl nodded, eyes wide, scanning the curtains for any flicker of movement. But the stage remained still, as 5 minutes stretched into 10. Anticipation curdled into confusion. People looked at each other with furrowed brows. "What's happening?" Someone muttered. Another fan checked his watch, unwilling to admit the silence meant the show was truly over. Yet hope refused to die, even as ushers edged toward the aisles. Even as the house lights finally began to rise, thousands of voices kept calling, clinging to the belief that Elvis Presley would never leave without one last song. The house lights brightened, bleaching the stage of its mystery. It was the signal no one wanted, the unspoken confirmation that the night had ended. Yet thousands still lingered, eyes glued to the curtains, waiting for a miracle. Security shifted uneasily in the aisles. Ushers gestured toward the exits, but the crowd resisted, rooted in disbelief. He wouldn't just leave, someone protested. Not Elvis. Their voices carried the edge of denial, like people unwilling to close a book before the final chapter. Backstage, Elvis stood with his cape draped over one arm, drenched in sweat, chest heaving. "I can't," he murmured to Joe Esposito, his road manager. "Not tonight." His words were quiet, but final. Esposito only nodded, knowing better than to press. On stage, the silence became deafening. The chants fractured into murmurs, then into pockets of angry shouts. Some clapped harder, desperate to spark a return. Others fell into stunned quiet, as though a great weight had suddenly settled over them. And then, like a ripple through water, the truth began to sink in. People lowered their banners. The little girl on her mother's shoulders finally asked, "Mummy, is he gone?" Her mother swallowed hard, unable to answer. The arena was transformed. A place that had roared with joy now hung in a hush so heavy it seemed sacred. It was not the noise of disappointment, but the weight of an unforgettable silence, thousands realizing they had just witnessed something rare. Elvis Presley refusing an encore, for the first time all evening. The crowd was dead still. When the first fans finally began shuffling toward the exits, something remarkable happened. Instead of dispersing into isolated streams, they moved like a tide, clinging to one another, reluctant to let the night slip away. The absence of Elvis had created an invisible bond, linking strangers through a shared silence. Near Section D, a man in his 30s held up a handmade banner, "We love you, Elvis," and instead of folding it away, he raised it high for everyone leaving to see. People around him clapped, not in demand this time, but in solidarity. The applause carried less noise and more meaning, a gesture of gratitude rather than insistence. On the mezzanine steps, a woman passed around a Polaroid she had snapped earlier of Elvis mid-song, cape flaring like wings. Strangers leaned in to look, their faces lit by both the image and the memory it stirred. They weren't just leaving an arena. They were carrying a relic, a reminder of why they had come, outside in the chilly February air. Groups lingered under the glowing marquees. Instead of rushing to cars, they huddled in circles, replaying the moment. "Did you hear how he held that last note?" one asked. Another replied, "I've never seen a crowd that loudened than that silent." Each retelling stitched the night into legend, their voices weaving memory into myth. Even children sensed the weight of it. The little girl from earlier clutched the program against her chest like treasure. She whispered to her mother, "We'll never forget tonight, will we?" The mother shook her head, tears in her eyes. What began as disappointment had transformed into reverence. The encore never came, but something else did. A communal realization that silence could echo longer than any song. The crowd, once clamoring for more, now found meaning in what was withheld, and in that collective understanding, they felt closer to each other, and closer, strangely, to Elvis himself. In the days after that February night, stories spread like wildfire. Newspapers in Nashville and Memphis ran brief notes about the show, but what fans remembered most wasn't imprinted, was the encore that never came. Bootleg tapes circulated, ending abruptly after Can't Help Falling in Love, leaving listeners puzzled by the sudden cut. Those who had been there needed no explanation. They carried the silence with them. Joe Esposito later recalled Elvis saying, "Sometimes the best note you can sing is no note at all." Whether he meant it as philosophy or exhaustion, it resonated. Fans repeated the line like scripture, attaching deeper meaning to what might have been a weary decision. In Knoxville, a small group of concertgoers formed a fan circle, meeting monthly to share memories. They called themselves the Last Song Society. At their gatherings, they didn't play recordings of that night. Instead, they honored the silence, holding a minute of stillness before every meeting. What began as disappointment had become a ritual of reverence. Artifacts from the show became sacred. The crumpled program, the banner scrawled in red marker, even a discarded ticket stubble, were preserved like relics. One fan framed his stub beneath the handwritten words. The night silence sang louder than sound. Over time, that night took on mythic status. Younger fans who hadn't been there asked older ones, "What was it like when he didn't come back?" And the older ones would smile softly, struggling to describe it. How do you explain thousands of voices fading into awe? By the mid-1980s, decades after Elvis had passed, one attendee donated his concert jacket to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Attaching a note, "I wore this the night the king chose silence." It became a quiet exhibit, overshadowed by brighter costumes, but for those who knew, it carried immense weight. The legacy wasn't just about a performance withheld. It was about how silence forged memory, how restraint could shape legend. Elvis had offered countless encores across his career, but this refusal became unforgettable, precisely because it broke the pattern. Sometimes, it's not what you give, but what you withhold, that echoes longest. The silence of that February night was not an absence. It was a presence. For thousands who filled the arena, it became a mirror showing the strain on a man they adored and reflecting back their own capacity for compassion. In that hush, Elvis reminded his people that he was not only a legend, but a human being. What lingers decades later is not the missing song, but the way the crowd changed shape in its absence. Instead of anger, there was acceptance. Instead of noise, reverence. A mass of strangers became a single, breathing body that learned together that love does not always demand. More, it sometimes means letting go. Legends are not built only by the moments of spectacle. They are carved just as deeply by the fractures, the interruptions, the pauses that force us to feel rather than to cheer. That night, the encore belonged to no microphone, no guitar, no stage. It belonged to silence itself, and to the thousands who discovered that silence can carry music all its own. Years later, when people speak of Elvis, they remember the fire of his youth, the power of his voice, the costumes that shimmered under the lights. But in quieter corners, there are those who recall something different. The night when the king chose not to return, and in that choice, he left a gift that no final song could equal. Silence became unforgettable. And sometimes, that is the truest encore of all. If this story touched you, share it with someone who believes silence can hold power. Were you or someone you never present at a concert where the moment of stillness mattered more than the music? Tell us below and let that memory echo once again.